Dear ladies and gentlemen, let's start our session. Please take a seat. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to moderate this session. Today we will listen a lecture of Maurizio Bussola, lead economist in the Chief Economist Office for Europe and Central Asia, World Bank. He holds a PhD in economics from University of Warwick, worked at the ICD, Overseas Development Institute in London, Los Andes University in Colombia, and other interesting places. He has intensively published in high-quality, peer-reviewed journals on trade, growth, poverty, and income distribution. His Hirsch index is 22, and Hirsch 10 index is 46. I think the topic of current lecture is hot and very interesting. If we compare the countries of Europe and Central Asia with other countries, using, for example, Gini coefficient that measure the level of vertical income inequality, then the situation in Europe will seem quite favorable. And compared with other regions in the countries in Europe and Central Asia, there is more or less extensive welfare systems and more generous social protection. However, at the same time, more and more people in Europe are voting for populist parties. Why? Maybe we should measure not only vertical level of unemployment, but also horizontal unemployment between different social groups, and maybe this is the source of social tension. And maybe many people in Europe feel the lack of opportunities in this unfair system. We will find the answers to this and other questions in the lecture of Maurizio Bussola. Before starting, I'd like also to thank Artie Grover, a senior economist in World Bank, for joining our section. Now it's time for lecture. Maurizio, the floor is yours. We have plenty of time.
Thank you very much, Olga. Good morning, everybody. Dobre utro. This is about the whole Russian that I know. So I'll speak in English, but I think there is a translation. So if you have any questions, please stop me, and if we can try to clarify. It's a rather a large study that we have. I'm going to present. So the storyline is developing through quite a few slides. So you have to be a little bit patient. But it is closing at the end, and everything should fall into place. We actually, as Olga has mentioned, we started this work with a question, which was the observation of the polarization of the voting in Europe and Central Asia, which is happening also in other parts of the world, and there may be many different reasons for that, and we have decided in this specific study to look at one angle of the issue, which is whether distributions of resources, inequality, may be behind some of the dissatisfaction with the status quo, and we find some answers, and that's what the whole report is really about. Okay, so I'll show you the whole story in this first slide, and then I go on and give you more details. So we start with an obvious observation that some of these mega trends that have been observed by many, globalization, technological change, shifts in the demographics, aging, are all creating a lot of change, which increases opportunities for some, but also some challenges, and it increases cleavages within societies. And observing these cleavages, we are making four major points. The first point that we make in this report is that it's not enough to look at inequality in the standard way, so to look at inequality among individuals, where your point of view is just comparing every individual or every household with everybody else, and figure out what is the dispersion of incomes. This is the vertical sense, where the point of view is the individual, but we have to take a different perspective, as Olga was saying, which is horizontal. Rather than looking at individuals, we look at groups of individuals, and this is quite important, because even if inequality across individuals doesn't change, some groups may be winning and some groups may be losing, and this perspective helps you see whether tensions and dispersion is transforming in social conflict. There's another important way to consider inequality, the nature of inequality, which is inequality of opportunity. So it's not, you can still have a similar level of inequality in a country, but the process through which this inequality is generated is less fair, okay? So people are quite comfortable to accept a level of inequality if this inequality reflects the effort. So if someone puts more effort, they may earn more money, and it's rather accepted that. But if that inequality is not reflecting effort, but is reflecting circumstances, whether you're coming from a rich family or a poor family, whether you were born in some part of the country or another part of the country, whether you are of a certain ethnic group or another, the skin of your, or the color of your skin, if those circumstances, which are beyond the control of the individual, are important or become more important, even if overall inequality doesn't change, that inequality becomes less tolerable, okay? So we have to go beyond the Gini measure, the inequality measure, to say something. That's the very first and probably most important point that we advance on the study. The second point is that if you observe Europe and Central Asia, including Russia, this is among the whole world is the place where we have developed institutions to take care about issues such as distribution. So there is a lot of intervention. The government and institutions redistribute a lot via tax and transfers, but they also intervene in the labor market. They are fairly tough on competition. So you thought, we thought at the beginning, well, okay, so even if inequality is increasing, or in horizontal sense, maybe not in vertical, there is a whole apparatus of institutions to take care of that. Well, what we show in the report is that, yes, this is true, but these institutions were built in for a different, in a different time, for a different type of issues, and they are not working so well with these new distributional tensions. So they are not enough anymore. So that's the second important point. The third point is that, okay, now we're looking at what beyond what we measure as inequality as economists, what are people thinking? What are the perceptions of inequality? So what is, in a way, if you think of it as the demand side of equity? Are people still demanding a fair system and an equal system? And the answer overall is yes. In fact, we see a gap between the objective measurement of inequality, what we economists measure, and what people think is going on. And most of the time, in most countries, people think the situation is worsening much more than what actually is measured. So this is the demand side of the story, and there is a lot of demand for equity. So if the two first things are showing that inequality is worsening, at least in horizontal terms, and the institutions are not taking care of that, but there is demand, there is a gap, and so this can create tension, and the social contract is not working anymore, and that's why you observe polarization of the voting, moving away from the status quo in political terms, and we end up the study with some principles of what can be done to rebalance the situation. So we have some policy implication, which is obviously in detail different country by country, but we are presenting some principles, and I'll talk about that at the end of my talk. So this is really the report, okay? So this is what we do. So if you have other sessions to go and you are happy with this, you can go now, but whatever I say from now on is details on each of these points. Yes, okay, so but before I go to the detail, let me say a word about this expression, social contract. It's a big word, and there's a whole political science, philosophy, and political economy literature about the social contract that goes back to Locke, Hobbes, Spinoza, and others. Rousseau ended up with Rousseau. Rousseau is the very first who used this term, but we use this term in a fairly narrower, perhaps, way, which is presented here in this slide. So when we think of a social contract, we think of an equilibrium, a stable equilibrium between three elements. Which are these that I already kind of alluded to. The first one is that the market forces generate a distribution of resources. The second element is the government, not just through taxes, but also through education, the distribution of assets pre-market, and by regulating the markets, change this initial distribution of market forces. And the third element is social preferences for the outcome of distribution by the market and redistribution by the government. If these three elements are in sync, then you have a stable social contract. Now, for any of these elements goes out of sync, the social contracts are normally flexible. They are not really strict rules written, but they can adjust. But if the imbalance is of a certain degree and and it's remaining for a long time, then you begin to see cracks in the social contract, social conflict, and then problems. So that's our view, which is linked to literature. You have some reference there. Binmore is one of the first to think about the social contract like a dynamic equilibrium in a game theoretical way. So in graphic terms, that's what I just said. You have three elements of the social contract: the market, the government policy, and the social preference and perception of inequality. Let me say a word, because this is a session about growth and macroeconomics. So before I go to the detail, I want to give you just one slide about what has to do this story. Why is it important from a growth perspective? Well, there are two ways that we can look at this. One way is looking at a relationship that goes from growth to equity. And what is relevant here is the fact that it's possible that in a situation where the growth rates are fairly low, a certain level of inequality becomes more salient. So it's rather easy, if you think of an extreme situation where there is no growth, it's very easy to sell inequality as a zero-sum game for a political entrepreneur. So if you live in an environment where there is no growth and you see your neighbor or you see other workers gaining, you can immediately blame them for your losses. So there are some papers by Ravi Kambur and Danny Roderick which are really talking about that. So a low level of growth makes inequality more salient, more important. But also it's important to look at the other way around, how inequality can affect growth. There is a large literature about that, and I just summarize a couple of ways to look at this literature here. One is to look at the institutional setting, and there is quite a bit of evidence which shows that if a country undergoes a shock and is not able to manage this shock really well, to distribute the effect of the shock in an equal manner, to have institutions of conflict, social conflict management, the impact normally is to lose growth. So there's this quite interesting, nice paper, again by Roderick, some years ago, which really shows that. It's called Where All the Growth Has Gone, or something like that. And it basically shows that in the decade before, when there were a lot of shocks, countries were managing well those shocks in terms of not having very big changes in inequality. There were also those who bounced back and didn't pay a high price in terms of lost growth. There's a whole much more recent full theory by Acemoglu and Autor about why nations fails, which is all about that. It's about the interaction between inclusive political institutions and inclusive economic institutions that go together, reinforce each other, and vice versa. Extractive institutions that generate problems and ultimately failure in growth and in the government. There's one other branch of the literature that looks at what I mentioned earlier about the inequality of opportunity, and there's a nice paper by Chico Ferreira, also at the World Bank, and colleagues for coming in the review of income and wealth, which look at at inequality as cholesterol. There are two types of cholesterol, good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. And so, again, inequality, if signals differences in efforts, is an incentive promoting device. So you want more inequality if it rewards effort, but you want less inequality if inequality rewards circumstances. So that's the bad cholesterol. If you have a lot of bad cholesterol, bad inequality, then that kills incentives, and that kills growth. A form of looking at bad cholesterol is the concentration of capital, concentration of wealth. Since this is normally transmitted between generations, this is also creating immobility, creating disincentives, and affecting growth. Okay, so all of this is my slide on growth, but it's quite important. Okay, let's go back to the report, and let's look at a few examples of the three elements. Okay, the first I talk about is these impact of what happens in terms of the market and the distribution of resources. So a couple of slides on vertical inequality across all individuals. So this is Western Europe, or the western part of Europe and Central Asia. Southern Europe, these are a group of countries: Continental Europe, Central Europe, and Northern Europe. And you can see that inequality has increased in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall from 89 to early 90s. You see that the lines are going up. But then overall, it's fairly stable inequality, right? So it's not increasing. It doesn't seem to be a big deal. In fact, if you look at the left-hand side, also in terms of global terms, the most unequal part of Europe is Southern Europe, where I am from, Italy, Spain, Greece, etc. But it's still 35. A Gini of 35 is fairly low. In global terms, in Latin America, you have Ginis about 0.5, in Colombia, 0.48 in Brazil, and also in Africa. So this is, in terms of levels, it's low, and in terms of trends, it doesn't seem to be so bad. If you look at Russia and other eastern part of the region, the picture here is even rosier. You can see that the trend is downward for a lot of countries. So really, the indication is that if you stop here, you say, well, okay, inequality is not a problem. Why worry about inequality? And that was part of the effort that I had to convince my management. It was, why you want to do a report on inequality if this is not a problem? Well, in fact, in the end, I convinced them, and I hope I can convince you as well. There is, before I go to the specifics of horizontal inequality, there is an important exception that you probably all know about it, which is these figures that I showed you about vertical inequality are on household survey data. So they don't take into account top incomes. If we look at administrative data as at the PSE, the Paris School of Economics, Group Piketty et al., you actually begin to see that when you take into account the concentration of top incomes, the story is a little bit different. So there is some pressure there. And this is the latest available estimate from the PSE data set on top incomes concentration, the amount of income that is in the top 1% richest, and you can see that Russian Federation is on the top of these European countries, with a concentration of about 20% of all income is in the hands of the top 1%. Even more worryingly is that the change between that period 1980 to 2014 is of 16 points. So it's most of this concentration has happened in the last 30 or so years for Russia. So this is even without going to the horizontal in terms, if you take into account the evolution of the vertical with the top incomes, this is already an issue. Okay, which doesn't negate what I showed you, the fact that for the 99% of the rest of the population, inequality is going down. But when you add this top 1%, you immediately, because it counts a lot, immediately you see the picture is becoming more nuanced. But let's move now to the horizontal tensions. Let me skip this. I mean, I already mentioned that it's an important dimension of inequality because it's if it's linked to social cohesion. When groups drift apart, there is a problem of social cohesion, which goes through identity many times. And there is a very nice study of Francis Stewart from Oxford, who has wrote quite a bit about this. Akerlof, the Nobel Prize, has this little book about identity economics, and Fukuyama just wrote another piece on that. So that's all interesting stuff that if you want to go deeper. The groups that we focus mostly are three. Disparity in terms of generations, so different age group, but more than age, coexisting at the same time is really cohorts. People were born in different periods. Okay. The other groups that we look is workers, or rather occupations, and the third is regions. So you can look at other groups. One that we don't is gender, which is really important as well, and the region has advanced quite a bit in terms of gender equality, but has been stalling more recently. And then there's another one which I tell something about, which is inequality of opportunity. Okay, let me give you some examples of the first inequality among dispersion among groups. And what you have here are two sub regions, two parts of the continent, and for each part you observe for different age groups in different time period what is the incidence of non-standard employment. Non-standard employment is employment that is not continuous, is not in long-term engagement, but is temporary, part-time, agency work, the Uber driver, if you wish, but not only that, etc. So we can't distinguish if it's all voluntary, because there is also some people that choose to work part-time, but it's, for now, forget about that. Now, every point is a different cohort on a line, okay? So a line is not the same people aging, but is different people at different, who are born in different time period. But what this graph shows that for different cohorts across time, for all the cohorts, there has been some increase in this incidence, more for Southern Europe than Northern Europe. So they start around 5% and they go up to 35, 40 in Southern Europe, and similarly a little less for Northern Europe. But now look at what happens if I consider the youngest cohort, or the one that were born most recently. If we look at in the past, in the 80s, everyone, those who were old in the 80s and those who were young in the 80s, the incidents were similar. But if you move in 2013, now those who were born earlier in 2013, so they are older in 2013, vis-a-vis the young one in 2013, then the incidence is different, yeah? So before in the 80s, all cohorts were exposed to the same incidence, but now the incidence is different. If you are young, you are much more affected than if you are older. Okay, so there has been a change, a structural change in this. And this affects not only the opportunities that you have in the labor market, but also your wages, which I show it here. So this is from different data, but it shows a similar story in terms of the incidence, but on the wage growth rather than on the jobs themselves. So in the left graph, we follow individuals when they are 30 to 34. So every little line is the growth rate or the level of the wage as they go from 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. For people who were born in different time periods, okay? So there is the generation that was born in 74 up to the generation that was born in 81. If you are a high school only graduate, you didn't have much hope for a great increase in your wages, no matter if you were an older generation or a younger generation. You see all these segments are more or less horizontal. But what has happened for the college graduate is quite remarkable. The older generation, when they graduated with a college degree, they entered the labor market, and then between 30 and 34, they were benefiting from a fairly steep growth of their wage. For the more recent generation, this has become much flatter. So not only they have less opportunities because they have more incidence in terms of less stable form of employment, but also their growth of income is much lower. So they get both issues bad. Tenure, let's skip it. There's a third way of, we look also at other issues in the labor market, but there's a lot of stuff I don't have time to go through it. But let's look at one interesting other finding that we have. And that we are able to do this only for 3 countries. Probably we could do it for Russia, but we didn't have the data at the time. But it looks now, instead of looking at the divide between generations, is looking at within a generation, and we follow that generation as they age. Okay, so we don't compare 2 generations born in different times at the same age, but we look at one generation and follow it through time. So we look at France, Italy, and Germany, and now on the horizontal axis you have when they were born, and we observe them when they are about 30 to 35. Okay, so and what we measure is the inequality within that group. So let me explain better. Those who were born in the 1930s, when they were 30, 35, so in the 60, 65, which is, we can observe there, the data, the inequality within that group of peers, all of the same age, for Italy was about the Gini was equivalent to the Gini of Japan, 0.31. So the generation of my dad, when he was 30, in the 60s, 65, among his peers, he was observing a certain level of inequality, which was a fairly equal country like Japan. Now, what happened to those who were born in the 80s and are the same, which is a little, I'm a little older, so is someone born 20 years after me, and they are 30, 35. Now they experience within their own group to live in a different country. It's as if their inequality between themselves is, if the country was only them, is as if they live in Chile. So from the generation of my dad to the generation of those who were born in the 80s, it's not the same country. So the level of competition, the level of this of inequality has become much higher within the peers, which is the group that you compare yourself the most. Okay, so there are reasons why that happened. One of which is the intergenerational transmission of it, etc. But this is a pretty amazing stuff. So it doesn't really matter the overall inequality that I told you at the beginning, the vertical total inequality, but those looking at groups, the picture becomes more complicated. There are other groups that I mentioned, workers. There's the whole literature about the polarization of occupation. I don't have time, I have to skip this. But let me give you one more that I said at the beginning. There was regions inequality. We observe in Europe, we have observed a lot of convergence, going back to the macroeconomy, convergence between countries, but within countries, there has been some divergence. This shows you, for example, for the gaps between rural and urban areas and or regions. Observe both the levels and the change for the period 2003-2013. So Russia is probably, well, you teach me, you know very well that there is quite a bit of inequality at the regional level, but it's also one of the countries for which this has increased the most. So again, the drifting apart, even if on average the country is growing, but the drifting apart attempts to social cohesion and can create problems. Okay, so one other way that we can look at this, instead of looking at vertical inequality versus horizontal inequality, is we look at one other thing that you hear a lot, the fact that the middle class is disappearing. And but when you actually measure well what happens to the middle class, defined as either a relative group around the median or an absolute between a certain level of income and another, we don't find that that middle class is really disappearing in terms of share of population. But if we look at the security of being in the middle class, then the picture changes a bit. And this is what we do here. So this is a rather complicated graph. So I have to explain you what you observe on the various axes. So what we do here is we have a panel for many countries where we look at individuals in the same individuals or the same households in different points in time. And the first one that we look at is between 2005 and 2008. And what we do, we measure how many of this group in this period, 2005 to 2008, fall into poverty. Okay, so we have how many people fall into poverty in that period, and we also measure for the same group of people what is the income that they have in that interval of time, and then we link the two things. The probability of falling into poverty and their income, and we are able to calculate what is the minimum level of income that you need so that your probability of falling into poverty is below a certain threshold, and that's the vertical line over there. Okay, so you see that if your income is above about $34 a day, your probability of falling into poverty, which you read on the horizontal axis, is below 10%. Okay? So if you define being middle class as secure not to fall into poverty, or at least to have a very low probability of falling into poverty, you at least have to have an income of $34 a day. And that was the case in the period 2005-2008. Now, what happens a few years back is that this whole relationship shift upwards. And on average, for these countries, which are about 20 countries that we do that, it's an increase of $6 a day. So now, to maintain the same level of security, not to fall into poverty, so to maintain that 10% low threshold, you now have to have at least $40 a day. So this $6, this 10%, 12% increase is a premium that you, if you wish, of insurance premium that you have to pay to feel still belonging to the middle class, yeah? This premium is different across countries. There are some countries that it has increased 100%. So imagine now the probability of falling into poverty if you don't have that increase in income is much higher, so you feel much more insecure. Yeah, so that's quite remarkable. We found one. I should skip this. There's evidence that inequality of opportunity is increasing in the eastern part of the region, including Russia, but I don't have time to go through that. So now, let's say one word about the policies that I mentioned, the institutions, the second part of the story. On average, the continent still redistributes most than other continents, so most than other regions in the world. The Gini of pre-tax and transfer is much higher than the Gini post-tax and transfers. It's about 20 Gini points. So it's on average the redistribution, vertical redistribution, is really remarkable, and it stayed the same in these last 20 years, as increase in some countries, decrease in some other countries. Now, however, as I said, this redistribution is, while effective in reducing vertical inequality, may not be so effective in reducing tensions between groups. And I give you one example of when you evaluate this redistribution in horizontal terms for a country, Hungary in this case. So what you have here is just the taxation, and you have taxation of different age groups. And this is the ratio of the share of taxation in two periods, in 2007 and 7 years later, in 2014. So the blue is the earlier one. You see that taxation is higher for the middle-aged, which are also those who earn the most normally. But what has happened, because of the flattening of the tax rate, in Hungary, is what has happened is that actually they have increased, forget about the yellow for a second now, sorry. What has happened is that between 2007 and 2014, because of the flattening, the tax rate has increased for the young, has been reduced for those who earn the most in the middle, and has been reduced, increased also a little bit for the older groups. So in some ways, the change of policy has potentially exacerbated the tension across age groups, across cohorts, rather than reducing it. The yellow is just, imagine now that we keep the exact distribution of at the beginning of the period in 2007, and just change the tax system on their initial distribution. And you observe that, in fact, it's not, sorry, I made a mistake. What the yellow shows is that I just keep the tax system the same and use the new distribution, and you see that it shifts parallel. So it's indeed not a shift in the distribution itself that changes the distribution, but is a change in the tax that is. So it's actually an intervention that we are able to but that's a technical point. So this is one case where the policy exacerbates rather than reducing the between group. There are examples of reduction of corporate tax rate that increase the concentration of income, which is also a problem. There are examples of change in the regulation of the labor market that have increased the duality of the labor market. So there are many ways that the institutions are not responding or are exacerbating this distribution tension. There's a lot more in the report. But let me give you now something on the third part of the social contract, which is this perception issue. What I gave you until now is the supply side of inequality, if you wish. What has happened in terms of market and what has happened in terms of, I need some water, you think? Yes, maybe I need some, thank you. What has happened in terms of the corrections or lack of corrections. Now let's look what people want. That's this point. So this is pretty amazing when we first look at this, and it's actually the same graph is found in the transition report of the EBRD, another regional bank or a regional bank that works on the region, with which we obviously cooperate. This is data from the LITS, the Life in Transition survey, and combined with actual income inequality data. On the horizontal axis, you have the change in Gini in this period, 2008-2013, the actual Gini changes. And on the vertical axis, you have the percentage of people who believe that inequality has increased, minus the percentage of people who believe inequality has decreased. So it's the net, the excess of people that believe inequality has gone up, on top of those who believe it's gone down. Okay, so the green line is zero, no change in inequality. And the question, the perception question is, do you believe inequality has gone up or down in the same period in these 5 years? So no matter what has happened to inequality, everybody believes it's gone up. And you see 50% of the country actually, the points to the left of the green line are countries for which inequality has gone down, but as percentages in Albania is the minimum, about 30%, but somewhere it's in Russia is 70%. 70% is an excess of those who believe it's gone down, so it's most people believe it's gone up, when inequality was stable or actually reducing a little bit. So what is going on? Why people believe inequality is going up when it's actually not and it's going down? So that's the gap that I mentioned, right? So there's a lot of evidence, a lot of literature that look into perception, look into what is important, what is the relationship between inequality and well-being, and these relationships are different in different countries. So your perception is actually formed by the inequality that is around, but also by other elements. So that's one part of the literature emphasized that, and there is variation across countries. One amazing fact that the same level of inequality is perceived very differently by different parts of the world is this World Value Survey statistics that Alezine and others have examined. For example, in the US, if you ask ask people whether they believe the poor can escape poverty on their own, 70% believe it's basically they can do that without any help. In Europe, it's much lower, it's 40%, and in Eastern Europe, it's even lower, it's 24%. So So there is a much more sense in this region that wherever you are in the distribution, it's not all your fault or your merit. There is a lot that you don't control, and so the intervention is needed. But there is also a sense that there are other things that matter, and not just your monetary position, but the process through which this monetary position is determined. And so what we do is try to understand, okay, so even if inequality is actually going down, it may be that the process through which this is determined is different, and that's one way. One of the things that we look is this insecurity that I already mentioned about the middle class. So again, this is Leeds, and this is a different question. The Life in Transition survey, it's a different question. This question is, if you are to evaluate on a 10-step ladder your position in the distribution, where would you place yourself today? And the 10 ladders, the 10 step in the ladder, are the step 1 is the 10 bottom poorest percent, then the second is the second 10%, and the highest step is the 10 richest percent. So what we do here is we put together the 2 bottom step, feeling poor. You place yourself in the bottom 2. And on the horizontal axis, we actually measure, we know where you actually are, but you respond that you are on the bottom 2. So the relationship is clearly downward sloping, but still someone that actually is on the top 10 believe and answers that they are in the bottom. But what is most important is that the difference between the green and we obviously control for other things to calculate this relationship. But what is striking is looking at the difference between the green and the blue line. So the green is determined for those people. We control for people having full employment for the whole 12-month period. The blue line is for those who are producing their income not through full employment through these months. So if you compare a person that is actually at the same level of income, because they belong to the 6th decile, but those who are generating that income via less than full employment type of job engagement always believe that they are poorer. You see that the probability is much higher. And that probability is equivalent to 3 steps, okay? So if you measure this on the green line, you measure the 6th decile versus the 3rd decile, the vertical distance is the same as the 6th with the 6th on the 2 lines. So it's staggering. So they value, if you want, we monetize this, they value insecurity as 3 deciles, okay? So it's in a way, it's obviously a failure of a policy to just hand them money, because you have to hand them a lot of money to compensate for that insecurity. So people value a lot insecurity. So that's why even if inequality is going down in monetary term, if insecurity has gone up, they may perceive that inequality, they translate that perception as if inequality is going down. So I hope I have convinced you that there are some issues with this social contract that for various reasons, either in the market, either in the failure of the institution to take care of it, or because there is still a perception, there's still demand for equality, this social contract may be not in balance. And indeed, we see that there are some relationship between distributional tensions and the cracks of the social contract. Here you observe the increase in the voting at the extreme parties for 3 different groups in 2 different times, the left graph. And you see that those who increase the most the vote at the extreme are those who are the losers in the occupational polarization. I didn't talk much about that, but these 3 groups are the green in the middle is the one that is most under pressure, because there are people in occupations that are routine, task-intensive routine, and those are the ones that lose, and those are the ones who vote the most. The increase in they were already voting the most, but the increase in the voting to the extreme is the highest. So there is a correlation. In terms of turnout, the young are always voting less than the old. As you observe in 2012, there is a 10-point gap between the old and the, but this gap is actually increasing. So there's another crack, if you wish. These are just two signs of the distribution tensions expressing themselves with dissatisfaction by voting at the extreme or by not voting, by exit or voice or exit. So what to do about it, and then I stop here because I talked a lot, but there are three principles that we think are needed to redesign or rediscuss these the social contract in the future. One is that while we have in most part of the region achieved universality in the provision of social of public service such as education and health, there is not such universal approach when it comes to insurance against risk. The risks have increased in the labor market and other places, and there is not such a universal system of protection. So that's the first big principle that we should take into account in redesigning a social contract. This is linked with the way that some of the social protection happens in the labor market, that a lot of the systems are linked to you benefit from social protection, social assistance, social insurance if you have a permanent job, and you also contribute to that if you have a permanent job. If you don't, then you are kind of excluded. So to level the playing field there, we need to basically give everybody equal protection, no matter the type of engagement that they have in the labor market. So that's the second principle. And the third one is that, if you wish, the two first are, I'm going very fast here, but if you wish, the first two are part of, on the giving side, the government giving to the people, but also you have to consider the tax side, the revenue side. And I didn't discuss much of this earlier, but the move in the last 20 or so years has been towards less progressivity, especially less progressivity in capital taxation. It's possible, and although you will hear a lot of opposition from economists that taxing a mobile factor such as capital is impossible, but you hear now a lot of more of discussion about that. So we need a more progressive taxation and a larger broad-based taxation, which includes capital. By the way, these three principles you can organize them differently. And the IPSP, you should look at this. It's the International Panel on Social Progress. They also came out a month earlier or 2 months earlier than us. It's a 3-volume, 300 people working on this. Princeton University, Cornell University, Ravi Kambur and Marc Florbet were the main leaders in this. They were both advisors to our project. They have these principles on their report, which are: we need to rescue the loser, which is post-market redistribution. We need to prepare the players, so we need to give them education, etc. And we need to change the rule of the games. Now, you see that there are a lot of different things but are reflected a little bit in what I was saying. So you need universal program with better coverage. The basic income story is also mentioned there. Education is an important thing to prepare both the young and continuous education for the others. There's the story of you have to start off the same, so we have to talk about inheritance, transmission of this, and then the change in the rules is about competition and rents and even the way that election system are played out. So it's even broader than us. So I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maurizio. Now we have approximately a half of hour for questions. Please push the button, and I kindly ask you to introduce yourself. Who have questions? Marek Dabrowski, please.
I have rather few comments, if I can. Marek,
yes, of course.
Marek Dąbrowski, Higher School of Economics, Bruegel, Brussels, and Case Warsaw. I think it's very good that you went beyond Gini, but I'm not sure whether you went enough. Because I am also economist, but my feeling is that to explain why we face so broad-based populism in various groups of countries, we must go beyond economic analysis. And because if you look for just basic empirical facts, you have incidents of rising populism in countries which experience serious troubles, economic troubles, and countries which did well, relatively well, in countries with high inequalities, low inequality, in countries which have inclusive institution, according to Acemoglu and Robinson, in countries which do not have, etc., etc. So I think that at least two factors should be added to this analysis. By the way, you touched those factors, but I am not sure whether enough. One is, I think, what is going in public debate, public communication and politics as a result of ICT revolution, which destroyed traditional media, which not only inform but educated people. You don't have any longer this situation. Even countries which have free media and most of them function like some sort of gladiator arena rather than source of information. And parallelly, you have expanding social media, which play extremely positive role in many respects, but unfortunately they also serve bad purposes. So they help spread various kind of hate, intimidation, political manipulation, also non-political, like for example anti-vaccination movement and others. And when we look for individual election campaigns in many countries over the last 5 or 6 years, these factors play a very important role. And also, by the way, when you mention that perception of inequalities is sometimes more pessimistic than facts demonstrate. I think that is exactly this factor, that politicians, but also unfortunately some representatives of academic community who are politically motivated, they can, suggest people that the picture is worse than this actually is, or they present some one-side story. I don't have any recipes how to deal with this factor, but I think we should. Also, I think that it can explain why we have now much more right-wing populism based on nationalism, on xenophobia, on misogyny, very often questioning this basic value which you mentioned, like gender equality. Why, for example, 10 or 20 years ago, if we have populist movement, it was rather left-wing, referring to social equality and this kind of economic equality. And the other factor, which is more within economic, but not only, and social issues, is the role of aging. You mentioned on several occasions, but I think that this is one of the major aging and decline of working age population is, I think, a major factor responsible for growth slowdown in advanced economies, which is very often missed in economic analysis. People ask why given economy in this country rather doesn't grow at the pace which grew 20 years ago, largely because it's completely different demographics. And also because there is increasing share of aging population, which is already beyond economic activeness. These people take care much less about pro-growth policy, good business environment. They are much more receptive of some time arguments related to their personal security, etc. It's more easy. This is my private hypothesis. This probably should require empirical verification, but they are much more receptive to various kind of fear propaganda. And also population decline creates more demand for migration, which is another important, I think, factor here. Migration always was rise tension in recipient countries, but because now there is more migration, is more demand for migration, I think it's also because of aging, this also is important factor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to reply? Or it's no, yeah. Yes.
No, thank you very much. Very good point. All of them. Let me first say that I find it unfair, but I put myself in the trap. I find it unfair to judge our report by its failure to explain fully the populism, the rise of the populism, etc. We didn't, although I sold it a little bit like that, it wasn't our intention to frame the report as that. So in a way, we started, we wanted to do an analysis to look at what has happened in terms of distribution in the region in the last 20 or so years, and a marketing tool to sell a rather terse material was to potentially link it, or is there anything that also helps explain what has happened in terms of populism? So we didn't start really to write a report to explain fully what has happened, what are the causes of that, but we rather look at what has happened in distribution, and is this helpful? Is this one element of a very complex set of elements that may be behind the rise of populism? So I agree that if you are looking strictly at, you're not fully answer the question of what is behind rise of populism. I agree, but we knew from the beginning that explaining all of that requires going beyond what is going beyond inequality and distribution. But I still think that we found some link, and it's they are helpful, and they are interesting, and especially in terms of the fact that the institutions that we have are not really designed to take care of these tensions. It requires some deep thinking, and that's also why it's also very risky not to do this deep thinking, because a lot of what the populist politicians are proposing are potentially gonna maybe create some benefit in the short term, but in the long term are going to harm the very people that they think they are protecting. So it's a discussion that we should indeed have. I agree with all the risks that the current media landscape is creating, with the fact that we all live in bubbles and of media consumption that reinforces our visions, and so we believe that the world is really coincide with the view of the world that we have, because we are confirmed continuously by the media that we consume that's the case, and so that's really dangerous. I agree. But that's a long discussion that we could have. I'm less fully convinced that the aging is a problem in terms of growth. There is not that strong evidence that dependency rate are actually really increasing. They are indeed, if we measure them in chronological age. That's really the case. If you have dependency rate, you have the number of people who are between 15 and 65, which are the working age over the whole population. Yes, it's increasing. But if you measure the ratio of active population of inactive population, there has been an incredible increase in activity rate for older individuals all across Europe. Not so much in Russia, perhaps, but so the dependency rate measured with chronological age is not the right statistics. So it's not obvious to me that for that reason, the increase in the dependency rate, the growth is going down, because you're not measuring the right thing. There is no evidence that productivity because of aged population is going down. In fact, there are very good, very, very interesting studies at the micro level, which shows that at the micro level, not at the macro level, but at the micro level, that shows that mixed age teams that are of people that are young and old, are actually more productive than fully young people, and definitely more productive than fully old people. This is because old people tend to be a bit slower and so less productive, but when there is a mistake in the production process, they don't tend to panic, they resolve the mistake fairly quickly, whereas young people tend to be much faster, but when there is a problem, they are panicking, they don't solve. So there is evidence on this. So there is not much evidence that innovation is going down. There is some evidence that there are less entrepreneurs among the older individuals, but even the age of the average age of the entrepreneurs has increased through time. So again, if you think you become an entrepreneur if you're only 30, then you say, when my population is aging, we have less entrepreneurs, but the age of entrepreneurs is also increasing. So there's quite a bit of accumulating evidence that demography is not destiny in terms of an aging population is a population of destined to grow less. But this is a longer discussion, and I believe that, however, that the political economy is getting more complicated, because it's true that older individuals tend to vote more for their own transfer, their own pension system, whatever they can extract from the system, rather than investing a lot in, say, education for the young. And if they vote more than the older and then the younger, then this can create a potential problem in the future. They also vote much less for they vote much less for migration, so they want more protection against migration, strangely so. Because they actually use migrants for social service, education, health services. So, so the political economy is getting more complicated with an aging population. That's sure.
Thank you, Maurizio. Please, other questions, comments, remarks. Welcome.
Thank you for such an
Introduce yourself.
Okay. Maria Sakaeva. I'm a sociologist, and thank you for so interesting report. And you're an economist, and that's why you focus on institutional dimension of inequality and financial and economic dimension of poverty. As a sociologist, I'd like to refer to cultural and structural dimensions of inequality and poverty, and here I'd like to refer to Sudhir Venkatesh. He's a well-known American anthropologist from Chicago University, and he's famous for a few books about modern ghetto, about poverty in the USA, and he refers and he mentioned in his books that once again you focused on money. I mean, in general, yeah. You mean that people are poor, or people are poor because they have low income, but Venkatesh argues that poverty is closely connected with cultural dimension. It means that, for example, black people in the USA or people of color in the USA are poor because they are stigmatized and they are excluded not only from financial resources but from cultural resources, social resources, human resources. And what is interesting and what is connected with your report, that Venkatesh argues that all social politics, all social programs of American government failed because they were based on wrong prepositions. I mean, he argues that American politicians and scientists and also economists, and that's why some scientists, especially economists, they don't like Venkatesh because he criticized neoliberal model of capitalism and argues that social policy is based on wrong prepositions. That's why politicians and scientists try to solve social problems on the basis of wrong instruments, which are based on wrong understanding of reality. And my question is, what if a World Bank is quite powerful institution, quite powerful organizations, you influence on world politics and European politics, including economy, and what if your understanding of reality, understanding of inequality is based on not wrong knowledge, but not full knowledge about the nature of inequality? Yeah, it's a debate. We should we should take into account also not only economic dimension, as I tell, but also social and cultural. But World Bank and objectively, you don't pay attention to these sides of the coin. I mean, when we talk about inequality, when we talk about poverty and so on. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going fairly deep here, but that's thank you for the question. I have it's hard to answer the fact that we may have the wrong view of the world and we're based on the wrong principles. But I'll try. The first part of my answer is that we there's a standard assumption in economics that your utility is based on what you consume. So your your welfare, your well-being is determined by the amount of consumption. The more you consume, the happier you are, the more the well-being. Now, that has been challenged in theoretical terms by the fact that people are not only care about their own consumption, but they care about consumption of others. So there is a whole group of papers and research that looks at the interdependence of utility, and so you have your utility is determined by your consumption, but also the consumption of others around you, and that is very closely linked to the identity economics that I was mentioning at the very beginning, the fact that you care about not just you as an individual living in the vacuum, but you care about the group that you live with. And so if the whole group is losing, you are less, your benefit, your well-being goes down as well. So that's a very very straightforward way to expand the theoretical way we think about utility in economics, and that has been done, and there are a bunch of theory papers that look at that, and you find that your view of the world changes a little bit, and you can explain. Frances Stewart, that I was mentioning, she says that, in fact, what distinguish social conflict transforming itself into actual active conflict is when tension between groups becomes too high, and then that's where it can trigger identity, can triggers us versus them, and then active conflict can ensue from there. So that's the first part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that I welcome you coming into a session with an economist as a sociologist, but we should do more interdiscipline work and listen more to each other. And a part of the work that we did for this report was to go to a conference, to work at a conference that was organized at Stanford by the sociology department there. So sociologists, at least in that department, are thinking of much more in terms of classes than in terms of inequality, but there is something that is common across the economists and sociologists, which is the commodification or privatization of production of public goods. So education, health, etc. Once they were mainly produced by the government or public, they were public goods. In many countries, they have become commodified and produced by the private sector, and that means when this production of public goods become private, then you can begin excluding people that don't have the money to pay for it, etc. So then you just create more inequality rather than reducing that. So we had a day and a half of hard work with sociologists, and we learned a lot, and I hope they learned a lot. But indeed, we should have more interdisciplinary work. So I appreciate that you ask hard questions and you came here. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one quick question, okay? Please.
Thank you very much for your speech, for your Yes. May I ask in Russian, please? Because I may do some mistakes. Что я хочу спросить?
My name is Katerin Slobodinyuk. I'm from the Institute of Social Policy of HSC, and I'm a researcher there. My research is between poverty, stratification of society, social policy. All the indicators you're looking at are close to me. I know the research paper about poverty risk. It was published in 2010. Lopez was taking part, and I cooperated with him. I have a different kind of question. You called your paper toward a new social contract. You identified key problems relating to inequality over a big set of indicators, monetary, vertical, horizontal, which all shows the need for a new social contract. I have a dual question. Number one, it's a challenge not with regard to new methods, but rather rethinking of theoretical concept. It's a challenge for theorists, primarily. Second question, can you recommend any people in rethinking this social contract? Recently, we had a conference at HSC on basic income. I understand it's one of the alternatives. This theoretical rethinking. Maybe there are some other attempts in rethinking. I think we are at a kind of a turning point theoretically, because these questions are underway in Finland, Switzerland. There is a referendum in Finland on basic income, and experiments are underway on introducing basic income. And I know the World Bank is studying this. Maybe there's something else, some alternative concept. But thank you very much for your presentation.
I missed a little bit the first part, but I think I got most of it. Thank you. Well, I just replied earlier that in theoretical terms there are ways of expanding our approach, which is to consider interdependence of the utilities, the fact that your welfare depends on not just whatever you personally consume or your strict household, wife and children, but it's husband and children, but is a lot of it depends on the groups with which you live, the culture, environment that is common, and so that has been done already for some time by economists studying development and studying conflict. They look at that when conflict is the extreme example of failure of a social contract, when people don't recognize any more authority to the government and just fight among themselves. So there are ways of dealing with that I mentioned. The basic income story also is not, as a policy instrument, it's not particularly new. Actually, during the Nixon administration in the U.S., the Democrats and the Republicans almost passed a legislation to have a basic income in the U.S. Then it didn't pass for some bizarre reason that the Democrats thought it was not enough, and so they blocked it. But it's not a particularly new idea, but it's indeed received much more attention now, partly because of this dissatisfaction with the status quo and the need of rethinking something new. The appeal to it is rather than giving something for nothing, is really to spread more equally the risks. Think of two examples, which are not really related to income, but they are related to this spreading of the risk. There's a nice study of a PhD student in Georgetown that look at, in the US, that look at what happens to two groups of young people that had two different types of health insurance. The first group has the health insurance that was linked to its own employment, and the second group had health insurance that was linked to the parents' health insurance. So the second group spent much more time going through employment, unemployment, employment, unemployment, employment, unemployment. So they do what we call search and get matched later to a better job. So although they are going through unemployment, in the end they end up in a better employment and earn better money, and they are more productive because their match is better. So it's the employer also is happier with them, and they produce more and earn more. The first group actually does much less of this, because they are afraid if they leave the job, not only they lose money, but they lose the coverage, the health coverage, which can be really expensive if they have a problem of health. So in that way, if you think of that as a basic income, it's the same thing. If you have a basic insurance that you can sort of leave an unproductive job and try to find a better job, but you have this basic income, you generate incentives to get a better matching, and in the end you will have more productivity. The second example is not in the US, but is again in this conference in Stanford. There was a presentation of a group of Scandinavian countries that were asking themselves why some villages in I don't know if it was Sweden or Finland or Norway anymore, but I can look it up. There are people who don't leave villages where there are no jobs, no good jobs, and they don't leave the villages, and they want to stay to go to town because they want to stay. They tend to be poor, and they want to stay close to the relatives because there is a form of insurance coverage through the network, the family network. If they go too far, they will lose that. And again, so these insurance against risks systems are imperfect, and we have to think of the basic income in those terms as an insurance system to improve the matching and in the end to improve chances for everybody. Thank you.
Our discussion becomes more and more interesting, but unfortunately we exhausted our time. I thank Maurizio Bussola for so interesting discussion, and all participants for so interesting question. I hope it's not last meeting with Maurizio Bussola, and I hope our cooperation continue. You will participate in our conferences, workshop in Higher School of Economics in future, maybe in September, and in other conferences. We always will be happy to see you in our university. Thank you very much again. And now we can continue our discussion during coffee break.
Thank you very much. With pleasure. Everything is available online, by the way, so you can